Larry, let's start with what has happened to Scott Ritter. We know that he wanted to be there with you and participate in this forum, but he couldn't be there because the State Department decided to seize his passport.
Right.
And
Yeah.
many people out there are asking, why Scott Ritter? Why not Larry Johnson? Why not somebody else?
Uh, Scott, when he travels overseas because of some previous issues in his life from 20 years ago, has to inform the State Department that he's traveling. So they knew about his travel plans. I don't. So they didn't interfere with my travel out. Um, I don't know if they'll try to interfere with my return. I've done nothing wrong, have violated no law. But what's clear, what the State Department did was an arbitrary, malicious attack on Scott, because they're going to argue, I think, that the passport was not properly marked. Well, the reason it wasn't properly marked is because the Biden administration screwed up when they issued the passport. And once Scott notified them about his travel plans, I think they quickly decided then that, they'd let him travel twice previously without any problems. And I think they wanted to make an example of him. And because what they could have done, if they were being honest and straightforward, they could have notified him by letter, hey, we need to issue a new passport, and they could have issued him a new passport, which would have had all the markings that they say should be in there. So this was just it's typical Biden and his administration. They are playing politics with the civil rights of Americans, and you know what they did, ironically, is attract more attention to Scott than he otherwise might have received. In fact, it was very much of a conversation at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which is what I attended, what Scott was going to attend. Uh, Americans, we're a minority here by choice. The American government refuses to participate and have any involvement with this whatsoever, and it's idiotic. There are 134 countries here. There are over 20,000 participants. I mean, it is an incredible experience, and it has economic. The primary thrust is the economy, and now BRICS is dominating the conversation. So you're seeing um, South Africans, Brazilians, Indians, Chinese, uh, people from throughout Africa, Senegal, South Africa in particular. I spent some time with Nkosi Mandela, the grandson of Nelson Mandela, just a very fine man. Um, he has been in the legislature in South Africa for the last 15 years. But the West in its um, narcissism, I call it, they're suffering from narcissistic personality disorder. They're assuming that the West is so far superior to the rest of the world, and yet the rest of the world is looking at the United States and saying, you know what? We are fed up with the United States threatening us with sanctions, fed up with the United States trying to interfere in our internal affairs, fed up with the bullying. There's no other way to describe it by the United States. You know, the art of diplomacy, of opening up conversations with people, you don't have to agree with everybody. You don't have to agree that China's got the best system of government or that China's got the worst system of government. Respect the Chinese that it's their government. Let them figure out how they want to run their country. The same for Iran, the same for North Korea, the same for any other country, Angola, Swaziland. Uh, it is up to each country to determine, or should be, to be able to determine their fate. and their path forward. And what they receive in Russia at this International Economic Forum is a platform of respect where they're not being talked down to. They're not being patted on the head like little brown people and asked to, go fetch us a cup of coffee. They're being treated as equals, and they really value that. And that's what the West is missing out on. The West is cutting itself off from the rest of the world. Think of it this way. Right now, the top 4 economies in the world, measured in terms of what's called purchasing power parity. So gross domestic product, they measure it in terms of if you make $100, what can you buy with that $100? Well, when you rank economies based upon that, what you discover is the top 4 economies are China, the United States, India, and Russia. So right off the bat, 3 of the top 4 economies in the world in terms of purchasing power parity are now cooperating together to try to create a new international economic system where the United States cannot hold other countries hostage by threatening sanctions or to seize their bank accounts.
The State Duma member, Leonid Slutsky, he said that our patience is certainly great, but it's not unlimited. He's talking about the Russian can use the territory of friendly countries to respond appropriately to missile and bomb attacks on Russian territory. How do you interpret this frustration of Russia?
There's a saying I learned in Spanish that the English translation is people confuse being good with being a fool. And what that means with respect to Russia is the West has interpreted Russia's patience, Russia's tolerance up to this point with outrageous actions on the part of the West as a sign of weakness on the part of Russia. And that's a potentially fatal mistake. And in fact, you've had both President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov say the same thing this week. And it is not just a coincidence that they've made those statements this week. It's a coordinated message that they're sending out to the rest of the world that they're not going to take it anymore. That the United States and the West are now on notice that any further attacks inside Russia are going to be met with a response. Some of the options Russia has, and I don't know if they're going to pursue these, but just let me lay out a couple of options that they have. They could supply more advanced missiles and rockets to insurgent groups that are fighting ISIS and U.S.-backed forces in Syria and could strike U.S. military bases or the bases of those entities in the Kurdish region that the United States is supporting. They could also help the Houthis, not only with improved weaponry that could actually take out a U.S. ship, but also provide intelligence that could be used. Doing the same thing for the Houthis that the United States is doing for Ukraine. Now, Russia recognizes that it's moving steadfastly forward in its campaign to demilitarize Ukraine, denazify Ukraine, and they recognize in the process they're weakening NATO. Yet, what does NATO do in response? They've issued statements this week about they're preparing for their ground troops to fight Russia on the ground. They're crazy. This is madness, absolute insanity being talked about by people that you think would have more sense, but they obviously don't. I'll put it very clearly. The United States and NATO If they decide to enter a ground war with Russia, we'll lose badly, and it may end up with the complete destruction of Europe. Europeans need to sit down and count the cost. Is it worth it? Because Russia's not seeking to conquer Europe. Russia's seeking to have its national territory respected and to not have to face every year, as has been the case for the last 16 years, of NATO and the United States conducting military exercises on the borders of Russia that are, when you're sitting there as a Russian looking at it, you see these as hostile, as intended to come after you. And given Russians' history, where they've been invaded from the West 4 times over the last 212 years or 210 years or 212 years, they're not sitting back ignoring that. They're taking it seriously. So these are continued provocations by the West. There's no justification for it. The West keeps coming up with justification. They keep trying to portray Russia as this country trying to recreate its, quote, empire. And we talked about this before in our previous discussions. Name me all of the colonies that Russia established in Africa. None. It was Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, Netherlands. They were the ones establishing colonies and exploiting the people in Africa. Same thing in Asia. You know, Vietnam was under the French control, and one of the reasons the United States initially got involved with Vietnam was more to try to help preserve French influence, not to free the people from communism. I mean, that was the lie, the big lie. So the U.S. is trying to use the same playbook, both with respect to China and to Russia, portraying them as these authoritarian societies hell-bent on conquering the world. And it's a lie. It's the West that has been involved with unrelenting wars over the last 70 years around the world, killing now over millions of people from countries such as Africa, Afghanistan, in Africa and Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. You know, it's got to stop. It really has to stop. And that's what you're seeing coming out of the Russians. They're saying it's got to stop. They're not going to sit back and be a punching bag. And with this feeble-minded president that heads up the United States, it's quite clear for the world to see that the United States is being led by an incompetent. And that was, today they had the plenary session of the International Economic Forum. Vladimir Putin was on stage along with the president of Bolivia, I believe, and the president of Zimbabwe, the leader of Zimbabwe. That was sending a message. One, Russia wasn't favoring the most wealthy countries, the most influential countries. They weren't pandering to China or to India. They were bringing 2 sort of small countries from the global south, putting them on stage with President Putin, treating them as equals. That sends a message. Then the fact that Putin can sit there and talk and answer questions extemporaneously over a 3-hour plus period. Can you imagine Joe Biden? Joe Biden can't even handle a 10-minute speech written out for him, and without falling asleep or wandering off in the wrong direction. So right there, the Russians are presenting for the world to see. This is Russia. This is the United States. Who do you want to follow? Who do you want to be partners with? And you're seeing that the Western alliance is really starting, I think it's starting to unravel. Turkey has been trying to get into the European Union for 30 years, maybe longer. And they keep being rejected, hey, because they're not really European enough. They're a little too dark and swarthy, if you know what I mean, that racist thing. And, it's like somebody trying to join a club, an exclusive country club, and they keep blackballing you, turning you down. And yet Turkey is an important country, particularly in the Middle East, and particularly as sort of a bridge between Europe and Asia. And now BRICS is saying, hey, come on in. BRICS isn't saying, yeah, Turkey, well, first of all, you need to do A, B, C, and D before we'll even consider you. And you have to do what we're telling you to do before we'll let you be a part of it. No. They're saying, hey, want to join, want to participate? Participate as an equal. Not going to trade in dollars. We're going to work out a different system. And I think that's starting to have some real appeal in Turkey because they get treated like they're equals, not like they're some servant from the plantation.
Yeah. Larry, how do you find the frustration in the Russian society toward these policies coming from NATO, coming from the United States and European countries? How do you feel it when you're there in Russia, in St. Petersburg?
That's the interesting thing. I think the Russian people, by and large, are bewildered, puzzled. They're trying to get what is with this war talk out of Washington? Because the refusal of Washington to understand and see from the Russian perspective what Ukraine means. I mean, look at what happened yesterday at the celebration of the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, when U.S., Canadian, British, some French troops landed on the shores of Normandy to start trying to take back Western Europe from the Nazis. They refused to invite the Russians, even though Russia fought 80% of the Nazi army and defeated it. The West only fought 20%, and not the best 20% by any stretch. So the West disinvites Russia, the United States in particular disinvites them. And they let in Ukraine, with the element of Ukraine that Zelensky represents, are the very Nazis that fought alongside Hitler's SS. That they had an SS Waffen battalion in Ukraine. And here we are today with the members of the Azov battalion and Reich sector. They're sporting Nazi swastikas. They're celebrating Nazis, the great-great-grandfathers that fought against the Soviets. They were the bad guys. And here is the West allowing those despicable people to disgrace the memory of the Allied soldiers who died in Normandy. Shameful, absolutely shameful. And so, the Russians view this with, they're not amused. I'd say it's more some bewilderment, but growing frustration that all efforts they've taken to try to communicate to the West and to try to have open lines of communication and dialogue have been thwarted by the West, not by the Russians. And let's recall, we're looking over the last 20 years. It was not Russia that walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It wasn't Russia that abrogated other arms control agreements. It was the United States. So let's assign blame where it belongs. It'd be, like I said, it'd be one thing if Russia had said, okay, we're going to throw away the ABM and we're going to build ballistic missile defenses. But that wasn't Russia. That was the United States that did that. So, we're in an upside down world. Now, the interesting thing is I was interviewed today by a German reporter, and he said it was his first trip to Russia. And naturally, given the history between Germany and Russia, both recently and going back to World War II, you'd think he was nervous. And all he could tell me, he says, I've never been more welcomed. And he said, and I've never felt more free than what I've experienced here this week. I mean, it's really left a lasting positive impression on him. So I think the general attitude of the Russian people, at least the ones I've been privileged to talk to, and I've talked to, quite a few this week, and average folks, the taxi cab drivers in particular are an interesting crew. Um, they like Westerners. They just don't like the governments that govern the Westerners, and with good reason.
Yeah. We've learned that in Germany, they're talking about preparing to fight Russia by 2029. And when they're talking about Germany fighting Russia, in your opinion, first of all, when just think of if Germany wants to get prepared to fight Russia, they have to have some sort of military industrial complex. We know at this particular moment their economy is totally devastated by this war in
Yeah.
Ukraine, and even car production is dependent on Chinese and on the United States. And at the same time, they're thinking of fighting Russia by 2029. We know that Russia has declared nothing so far that means anything about fighting Germany, and they have no animosity toward Germany. And
No, no.
how do you find this mindset on the part of Germans?
I mean, it's as this German reporter told me. He says the average German is just mystified by their government. They can't believe the government is taking these kinds of positions. At least, the generation that, to be crude about it, got their ass kicked by the Soviets. They're dying out, but the Soviets crushed Germany. You know, millions of German soldiers died in that futile attempt to try to conquer Russia, to defeat Russia. Today, the German military is no match for Russian military. And in fact, all of NATO combined is no match for the Russian military. It's not to say that the West could, not inflict some damage. Certainly, they could cause great harm to the Russians. But the Russians are prepared to fight back and fight back against what they view as an existential threat. They're not going to let the West bully them and threaten them and try to hold them hostage. That's not going to happen. And that's why I described in one of my presentations before the International Economic Forum, I said, history doesn't repeat itself, but history sometimes rhymes. And the rhyme here is bricks and Leningrad. So starting in 1942, when Leningrad was surrounded by Nazi forces, they never were able to enter the city. The Soviets held them off, but Hitler expressly ordered that the population, not just the army, but that the population of Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, previously known as Petrograd, but originally it was St. Petersburg, which was actually of German origin, surprisingly, that they withstood that Nazi onslaught. They lost, over 800,000 citizens of St. Petersburg died in that 2.5-year siege. And, let's put those numbers in perspective. The United States, in the entirety of World War II, fighting in both the Pacific and the European and African theaters, they lost half that number over a 4-year war. The Soviet people, the Russian people that inhabited St. Petersburg at the time, suffered terribly, but they survived. Now, that was an effort by the West, embodied in Hitler, to surround them and crush them. So here we are now with BRICS, standing up as an alternative to the US-controlled financial order, international financial order. And the United States and Europe are doing the best they can to try to surround Russia. But this time it's not going to work because they can't just surround Russia, because Russia is now aligned with the Chinese and with the Indians and with the South Africans and with the Brazilians. So the West cannot surround them, even economically. And when it comes to economies, in terms of the production of food, production of oil, natural resources, uranium, the United States is still dependent on Russia for uranium shipments, for God's sake. And yet we feel that we get the right to threaten them. I mean, that's just stupidity on an industrial scale. So this attitude of the West that somehow they can match up militarily with Russia, it's like a psychological disorder. I keep referring to it as the narcissistic personality disorder. You know, anybody that's dealt with a narcissist, where there's a person who believes that their accomplishments are the best of all, that they're the smartest, they're the best looking, they're the most intelligent, they're the richest, there's nobody better than them. And then as a consequence of that, they treat others as if they are, you know, toilet paper to be tossed away, refuse, garbage. They don't acknowledge and accept anything that the Russians or Chinese have to offer. They're dismissed as lower class, lacking in intelligence. I mean, it's bizarre, because what the West once was in terms of an industrial power is now fading. What the West once was in terms of a military force is fading. As an industrial force, fading. Its ability to provide most of the world's power, non-existent. So this is, you know, you got to step back and just sort of scratch your head and say, what are these people thinking? Because if they press this forward and it does grow into an actual war, it's the West that's going to suffer in a way that they've never suffered before. Europeans tasted a bit of it in World War II. Yes, they suffered, but the United States didn't. You know, the United States was candidly hardly touched. You know, we get all weepy about Memorial Day and Veterans Day and D-Day. Oh, yeah, and Iwo Jima, oh, 3,500 died, or 4,000. You know, those were casualties for 2 days at the Battle of Stalingrad, all right? And that battle went on for months. So the West doesn't even have a barometer by which to measure these things. And yet in its arrogance, insists that it knows better and it's superior to the Russians and the Chinese. And that's why, you know, you saw Lavrov and Sergei Ryabko, the deputy foreign minister, and Putin to say, hey, the West is getting ready to make a fatal mistake.
When it comes to the Germany and their concept about fighting Russia by 2029, do you think that in the mind of the NATO countries, they're thinking of the continuation of this war until 2029? Wow. Is
Oh yeah,
that the case?
they're thinking, yeah, they're thinking about it, absolutely. But they don't have the capability. I mean, for God's sake, the United States cannot produce a fraction of the artillery shells that the Ukrainians say that they need, much less the artillery barrels that go with the howitzers that fire those shells. I mean, I keep bringing this up in different podcasts, but I can't drive the point home enough. The United States can't beat the Houthis, for God's sake. We've been at it for 6 months with the aircraft carrier task force out in the Red Sea, and it hasn't stopped the Houthis from attacking ships, despite bombing and killing Yemeni citizens. They're not really chewing up and destroying military assets. They're just creating more and more animosity towards the West because the people, the relatives of those who have died in Yemen want revenge. And it's that kind of revenge, the desire for revenge. It exists in Iraq. It exists in Iran. The United States has a very bloody trail that it's left in its wake over the course of the last 70 years.
The way they're talking about the continuation of this war, Larry, do you think that Russia, it seems that they don't trust the West anymore? And do you think with this current state of the Russian mindset, do you think they would let Odessa and Nikolaev in the hands of Ukrainians, or they're going to capture these two key cities?
Oh no, I think they'll ultimately take them. Why should they trust the West? We've already established that with the Minsk II agreement, which was negotiated supposedly in good faith, I think it was Hollande and Merkel that did that negotiation. Merkel admitted they lied, that they weren't serious about the agreement. It was just simply to buy the Ukrainians some time to build up and get stronger so they could defeat Russia. And the Russians trusted them at the time. That's the thing. The Russians, you could make the case that the Russians were naive, that they foolishly trusted the West, but no longer. The Russians they've had it up to here, said, no, we don't trust the West at all. They're going to have to do something verifiable and provable. They don't get the word of the West, the promises of the West are meaningless. It's sort of like, if you've ever had an alcoholic friend, they keep promising you they're going to stop drinking. Just, can I borrow another $20? I just need one more bottle. And after a while, you go, no, I'm cutting you off. You're going to have to show me. You're going to have to show me you can go without a drink for 2 weeks before I'm going to help you financially. Well, they don't want to do that. That's the West.
You've mentioned that Turkey was waiting for the EU membership since 1999, and finally they've decided to go to join BRICS. And before this news coming out, we've learned that the Turkish government said that if NATO wants to fight Russia, they're not gonna participate in this kind of fight. They're not gonna fight in Russia. And that's
Yeah.
huge. We know
Oh,
how
yeah.
important Turkey and the army of Turkey is within NATO.
Yeah, in NATO, Turkey right now represents the second largest army. And actually the one that's probably most combat capable of all the armies, including the United States. And plus, they occupy the Black Sea and the corridor between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. They occupy strategic territory, and the United States and NATO, if they can't operate there, they've got even bigger problems. And see, on top of that, Hungary is moving in that direction. The Serbs, while they're not a member of NATO, they're not about to allow their territory to be used. It looks like Slovakia, who is a member of NATO, is going to fall in line with Hungary. So you've got, and then the Italians, Maloney is like saying, oh, wait a second. We're Italians, we're lovers, we're not fighters. Uh, NATO is not, despite the claims of Biden and others that, oh, more unified than ever, nonsense. That's just a bunch of self-delusional lies.
We've learned from the Hungarian foreign minister, he said that NATO is preparing to fight Russia. And at the same time, there are articles in foreign policy, they're talking about the NATO's plan to fight Russia. In your opinion, is there any sort of chance of having a conventional war between these superpowers without going nuclear?
No, I don't think so. And The problem is it will be the West that tries to go nuclear first because they're going to be get beaten so badly on a conventional front. They don't have the means to conventionally fight Russia. They won't last 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. They just don't have the logistics. They don't have the food, the ammunition, the vehicles, the tanks, the howitzers, the air defense systems that they can throw. They've already given them to Ukraine and they haven't succeeded. That's the point. I mean, my God, they just, you know, it's sort of, we made fun of the French in the past, but I'll continue to do so. Oh, the French are going to train the Ukrainians. And what? How to surrender? Then I know some French listeners, oh, they take great umbrage with that. Hey, folks, name me the last war you won without the West helping you. You can say, well, the American Revolution, the French played a critical role there. God bless the French. Thank you, Lafayette. But apart from that, the French haven't been exactly racking up victory after victory. They got waxed at the Dien Phu in Vietnam. So they got, ultimately forced out of Algeria. They've been forced now out of the Sahel, forced out of Sudan. They're not some great military power. They like to think they are. They're still glorying in their colonial empire days. But, when it comes to actual putting troops on the ground and sustaining them and being able to conduct coordinated combined operations, can't do it. Can't do it in a way they can sustain. They'll be killed. They're gonna. They should have. Napoleon learned in 1812. Okay, invading Russia, but fighting Russia is a bad idea. Well, what was true 212 years ago is true today.
Putin has reported that Ukrainians are losing manpower by a number of 50,000 per month.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and at the same time, we're hearing that the duration of training in Ukraine is reducing to 15 days. Larry, when you look
yeah,
at 15 days, it's unbelievable how they're training these soldiers, how they're sending to the battlefield without having any ability, any skill to fight.
yeah, yeah. Well, and we've talked about this before. At least, like in the U.S. Army, minimum 13 weeks of basic training. And that basic training is just to teach them how to work as a unit, to march in formation, maybe to get basic training with firearms, not necessarily becoming qualified experts by any stretch. Uh, Learning how to clean, disassemble a rifle, and then put it back together. Um, this let's again talk about some of the training. The French, when they were training the Ukrainians, and I got this. I actually met with the colonel in the Ukrainian militia, formerly Ukrainian militia. Now they're incorporated in the Russian army. He was telling me about debriefing some of the Ukrainian prisoners. So when they were training in France, they were trained on a particular what they call a short-barreled rifle. It's less than 16 inches. They could fire, full automatic. But then when they got back to, but it was a French design rifle. So when they get back to Ukraine, what are they given? They're given an AK-47, which has a completely different type of ammunition and a completely different way of operating and a completely different way that if it malfunctions, how you have to take it apart to put it back and clean it, put it back together. That's a recipe for disaster, as we saw with the failed counteroffensive where Russia defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So the West has yet to come to grips with the fact that their training programs are inadequate And you can't, when you just give a guy, basic orientation for 15 days, they're going to be lucky if they last 2 days on the front lines. And in many cases, they're being killed, or some are surrendering and defecting to the Russians.
Can you speculate on what's going on with Zelensky going to Philippines? Because it's so strange why he went there. And we know that Putin, after his inauguration, he went to China. And Zelensky, after the extension of his term under the martial law, he's going to Philippines. It's so
Yeah,
strange
yeah,
why he's doing this. And the other thing that has happened, it seems that everywhere that he's going, he says that the next move of the Russian army would be you. They're gonna attack you. He said to the Philippines that they're gonna
yeah,
after Ukraine, they're gonna go after you.
yeah. It was just nonsense. He's desperate, and he is as out of touch with reality as Adolf Hitler was in his last month in the bunker in Berlin. Equally delusional, moving imaginary forces around on the board. Um, the Ukrainian soldiers are not highly motivated, well-trained forces. They've got some good fighters, got some brave people. I'm not suggesting the Ukrainians aren't brave, but you can be brave and stupid and still die. And that's what the Ukrainians are facing. That they're going to be exterminated through their own self-immolation. They continue to throw themselves at Russian positions without having a plan. And the Russians have a plan, and they're methodically executing it. It's just not going as fast as many in the West want it to, or think it should. But that's why, the reality is the Soviets defeated the Nazis, not the United States. The United States and the United Kingdom played a role in helping the Soviets defeat the Nazis, but it was the Soviet Union that defeated Nazi Germany, not the other way around.
How do you feel right now? You're in Russia, in St. Petersburg. How do they feel about Georgia and what's going on in Georgia?
Well, they saw that as just another attempt at a Maidan, just what the West tried to do in Ukraine to subvert the system using outside money and surely with intelligence support from both the MI6 and CIA. I'm fairly positive that that's what happened, but it was thwarted. Yeah, I mean, again, you step back and think, why is it objectionable to say that if you got 20% or more of your money, at least 20% or more, coming from an outside source, that you need to report that? That's what the United States requires as far as a Foreign Agents Registration Act. So, if you're getting that kind of money, you need to report it. So, that it failed. At least the Georgians recognized they were being played and played for suckers, because a lot of those people that were showing up to quote protest were being paid by people like George Soros and others, or out of organizations that are linked to George Soros. And then when you saw, foreign ministers from other countries and like the Baltic states come in and side with the protesters, we talked about that before too. The United States would be appalled if, say, the government of Hungary, the government of Russia, and the government of China sent their foreign ministers to attend a Donald Trump rally. Oh, the White House and the media lose their minds. And candidly, that would be inappropriate for Russia, Hungary, and China to do. That's outside the bounds. Russian and Chinese recognize that, but good God, the West doesn't when it comes to Georgia.
Lloyd Austin was asked if the United States planned to create a an alliance system similar to NATO in the Asia Pacific region. He said that the answer is positive. And do you understand the policy? What's the policy in that region?
Uh, Throw something at the wall and hope it sticks. You know, you've already had people writing in, I think it was Foreign Affairs or Financial Times. Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby is the grandson of William Colby. I had William, who was the director of CIA. I had William, aka Bill Colby, who ran the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which was an assassination program where they murdered Vietnamese citizens. He was the head of CIA in the 1970s after Richard Helms. And he was the one, it actually turned out he was the source for Cy Hirsch's articles with respect to assassination programs and other U.S. covert activities that had been used to overthrow governments around the world. So here's Colby, part of the deep state. Now here's his grandson, still, working away at the deep state thing. And his grandson said, "Oh yeah, we need to sort of forget about Ukraine and we need to turn to fight China. China's the threat." Last time I checked, China's not planning on invading San Francisco or Los Angeles. Of course, the Biden administration's letting lots of Chinese immigrants into the country illegally. I don't see how that could be a Chinese plan without, the full cooperation of the United States to allow it to happen. China is not trying to take U.S. resources. The United States, we've got a massive military budget that's got to be sustained, and one way you can sustain it is claiming, "Oh my God, we need to be ready to fight China. We need to be ready to go to war with China." Well, China keeps hearing this belligerent talk out of the West. It's like if you and I were neighbors, and I kept coming out of my house every morning and saying, "Hey, Nima, I'm going to come over there. I'm going to break into your house. I'm going to rape your wife." And I keep doing that every morning. And then you decide to get a gun, install a security system, and get a couple of big Rottweilers. And I'd go, "Hey, how dare you do that? You're being provocative." No, you're reacting sanely to my threats that I shouldn't have been making in the first place. Okay? That's what we're doing to China. We're making these threats. And then when the Chinese react to our threats, we go, "Well, wow, how dare they?" I mean, God, it's a screwed up world. It's Alice in Wonderland come to life, upside down.
The Minister of Defense of China says that China's army is ready to defend justice in the world together with the Russian army. And at the same time, we've learned that the Biden administration is trying to define again that we're going to defend Taiwan against China. When they're talking about justice and defending justice, do you think that they're talking about Taiwan? They're talking about Africa? They're talking about Middle East?
Well, I think what the Chinese are now talking about, they are going to closely collaborate with the Russians on military matters. And we've seen that over the last now 5 years, the Russians and Chinese have conducted annual military exercises with Iran. So I think they're again laying down a marker that if the United States is going to start intervening militarily any place in the world, that China and Russia will start pushing back. Right now, the United States is taking a lot of provocative actions towards China, and in response, China has set up basically a screen of ships around Taiwan, showing that if it decides to, it can enact a blockade. And if they decide to blockade Taiwan, the Taiwanese aren't going to be happy about it. Then if they start firing anything at the Chinese will fire back. Because if they're firing, they're going to fire with Western weapons that the West was not supposed to provide to Taiwan. That was part of the agreement back in 1979, negotiated after Henry Kissinger left office. Uh, so, the Chinese are prepared to enforce a blockade on Taiwan. I don't see the Chinese necessarily as invading Taiwan. I don't think they need to do that. I think they can handle it with a naval blockade, but they'll also have Russian assistance. And so then it's up to the United States to decide, okay, we're going to try to destroy that blockade. Well, you get into a shooting war with the Chinese, they can shoot back. And they have one thing the United States doesn't. They have hypersonic missiles. But they also are closer from their line of, base of support, their lines of communication, that they can launch thousands of drones that can swarm and overcome U.S. naval ship defenses. It is, again, the United States is looking to pick a fight that it can't win. Reminds me, there's a great video on YouTube of some short, fat white guy, and he's sitting behind a rather large black man. And this white guy keeps putting his feet up on the seat, on the armrest. And the gentleman, to his credit, keeps, knocks the feet down and keeps asking him not to do that. And this obnoxious little fat guy keeps escalating it, and to the point where he stands up. Yeah, you want to do something about it? And the black man stands up and is like, this little white guy's like 5'6", and the black man's like 6'4", and he's muscular. And you see the white guy look up and go, okay, I'm sitting down. And he put his feet down and he left the guy alone. That's what the United States is doing to China. I'm not saying that China is a 6'4" black guy, but I am suggesting the United States may be a 5'6" fat guy.
Larry, just to wrap up this session, in St. Petersburg, you feel the people you talk with and you have been in contact with, do you feel they are on the right side of Putin or on the left side? The right side would be the most radical. They want to finish this war as soon as possible, or they're just leaning more toward the Putin's policy that is going little by little.
Yeah, right now the not just the people in St. Petersburg, but people in Moscow and really people around the country, they've not paid a heavy price in this war. Yeah, they've suffered casualties, but I was talking to one Russian in particular today who came up and said, "Oh, I love watching you," and he's, I think he watches your program and watches The Judge, and he said, he keeps hearing, he says, I've got all these friends that I grew up with. He's actually grew up some in Texas, but he's a Russian. And they keep telling him, oh, you're losing all these Russians that are being killed and they're hiding it. He goes, you can't hide that in Russia. Everybody's got a cell phone. They're running around like this. They can take pictures. They're on TikTok. They're on a variety of social platforms. They can record videos just like the Ukrainians are recording videos showing seemingly endless rows of flags in cemeteries because of the enormous casualties the Ukrainians have suffered. If Russia was suffering those kinds of casualties, you'd see it in social media. You're not seeing it in social media. And that's not because Russia's an authoritarian dystopian state, as I heard some nitwits suggest the other day. It's just they're not having because the military leadership is making sure that they are not using tactics that are going to incur a lot of casualties on their side, hence slow pace of movement, significant casualties they're inflicted on the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are slowly being bled to death. And the Russians are quite happy to do it slow without jeopardizing their troops. And then the West keeps scratching its head. Well, why aren't they doing that? Well, maybe they're a lot smarter than we are. That might be one conclusion.